I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we're meeting a New Yorker behind a program that turns bucket list wishes like a tugboat ride into real-life adventures for older residents, with reporting from New York Times journalist Winnie. But first, Grace Ashford is covering New York State government and politics for the Times. She's been reporting on the final days of the state legislative session, including New York's standoff with ICE over immigration enforcement, what's actually in that $269 billion state budget, and most recently, a push to put a moratorium on new data centers in the state. Grace, thanks for joining us.
So good to be here, Jeff.
So this is a huge budget, and they've been negotiating it for a while. I'm wondering, what are the highlights to you? What made it in, and what are some of the things that did not make it in this budget?
The lawmakers only passed the final state budget in the second to last week of the legislative session, which left them almost no time to advance their own legislative priorities. And, not only does that mean that she has fewer bills that she needs to deal with, that she maybe doesn't like, but it also meant that she was able to get a lot of her legislative priorities. So you mentioned the kind of standoff with ICE. The governor championed that and was actually able to shape it very significantly. She also was able to win pretty major concessions in terms of rolling back parts of the state's climate law. In 2019, the lawmakers passed a really, really ambitious climate law that has been very difficult to implement since then for a lot of reasons, but probably the largest being the Trump administration's hostility to renewable energy. That was a real problem for the governor, and she successfully was able to, win these concessions from lawmakers so that New York will be on track to meet those goals. Another kind of really key thing that was important to the governor was auto insurance reform. And so what we really see at the end of the session is the governor with a lot of accomplishments that she can bring and sell to voters, and lawmakers with, fewer because they just had less time.
Right. So, but this is the latest budget since 2010. Lawmakers don't get paid while no budget is passed. And, Governor Hochul has said she'd rather get the budget right than be too concerned about it being on time. I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Does she have a point with the on-time-ness of the budget? And do you think lawmakers not getting paid sort of paved the way for some of these victories the governor got?
Lawmakers would say no, in that they insist that they made no concessions based on their own kind of personal, salaries. And I think that's by and large true. But I do think it's kind of impossible to deny that this has been a very, very successful tactic for the governor, for all the reasons I just laid out. And, what her answer has been to that sort of question of, aren't late budgets a symptom of, government inefficiency? She says, no, this is the way that I can, assert my policy priorities. And frankly, New Yorkers don't actually care what happens in Albany so long as their, regular services are continuing, which do occur because the lawmakers will pass extenders. So it's not like a federal budget shutdown where there's literally, where lots of people are not getting paid. In this instance, it's just the state legislators, which does sort of explain why they do get a bit crabby about that.
The Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, has had some comments about this process, right? Are we expecting to see changes to the budget process next year, maybe?
We keep asking that. He sort of said, stay tuned, but I'm not doing it again this way. In practice, there's a lot of things that could be done to change the budget process, but the most significant ones would require essentially the speaker, Carl Hastie, to take, and maybe in concert with the Assembly Majority Leader, Andre Stewart-Cousins, to take on the governor. And in fact, as all three would say, they are very, kind of largely they're political allies, and they get along and they get a lot done. And, I think both Mr. Hastie and Ms. Stewart-Cousins would say that they don't particularly want to take on the governor. They would just like a fairer process. But I think what we've seen is that, the process is not going to get fairer on its own.
Let's dive a little bit into some of the topics, the issues in the budget. Data has been a big issue. There was a bill to stop, stores from using your data to sort of charge you more. There's also a 1-year moratorium on new data centers. So I'm wondering why the sudden focus on data and how these issues might affect the state.
I mean, look, Jeff, we're seeing the world change around us almost at the speed of light. It feels like, what with, new AI innovations being incorporated into various things. And I think what you're seeing, especially given the kind of hesitancy at the federal level to take on, regulation of these issues, is that you're seeing states feel like they need to step up and play more of a role. So the first bill that you mentioned regards what, its proponents call algorithmic pricing or dynamic pricing, and what its critics call surveillance pricing. And that is essentially that companies would be able to use the data that they have on you, that they've gathered and purchased from, any number of different sources, to make an assessment of how much you'll pay for their product.
This is kind of like Uber dynamic pricing, kind of.
It's similar, yeah, but as opposed to only, kind of analyzing, how many people are demanding the thing at that time, they also will be able to look at, all sorts of things about your history and, your financials, etc. And a lot of this, to be clear, is not being used just yet. And there are people in the tech industry that say it will never be used, but lawmakers, and especially I think Senate Deputy Majority Leader Mike Gianaris has been a big proponent of this, has been saying that they have the tools and that they will use them if regulators don't step in and tell them not to or tell them how to. So his bill is actually, it's rather narrowly targeted to just grocery stores and pharmacies, and it says that those places cannot use consumer data to set prices. This has obviously seen a very significant pushback from business, who say that actually the only way that this information and these tools are being used right now is to offer discounts. So that's sort of at play. And in fact, we don't know whether that's going to end up passing or not. There's been a big kind of push in these kind of final hours. So as of taping, it's still up in the air.
And New York is involved in the sort of national question, or maybe international question, of how data centers and where they're placed and their effect on communities, right?
Yeah, I mean, and as you said, obviously this is a global question, but also a very, very local one. And what we're seeing a lot of is pushback from, local communities that don't want to have, a large data center placed in their area. The biggest reason is really actually because of energy costs. There have been a number of studies that have come out that have said that when a big data center comes in, because these centers use a tremendous amount of energy, that they that purchase drives up the cost of energy for everyone else. And so lawmakers are trying to grapple with that and figure out how true that is, what can be done about it potentially, as well as the environmental impacts of these large centers, which need to be cooled to keep from overheating and all sorts of other things.
There are some national issues on the agenda. They passed laws regarding ICE wearing masks and sort of banning them from schools and hospitals. But the Department of Homeland Security was concerned about that, right? Where do those particular bills stand?
That's right. Yeah, my colleague Hamed and I reported that the department, pardon me, that's my dog, that ICE, had already circulated a memo saying that they were not going to comply with any of these state level mask bans, including New York's, even before it had passed. But it did pass, and that was actually included in the state budget. And what that really does is it sets up, yet another kind of clash between states and the federal government that will play out in court. Lawmakers have said that they, looked at the legislation in places like California and some of the problems that it had and tried to craft their law to withstand, a court challenge. But it really remains to be seen. But to your point, that kind of the ambition of that package is to create really spaces where ICE can and can't come, and the places that they can't go without a judicial warrant. So that's a warrant signed by a judge suggesting that there's some criminal issue. Would be schools, churches, hospitals, and homes.
And the governor, I know she speaks regularly with President Trump, and she's been talking with the Director of Homeland Security, Tom Homan. I'm wondering if her relationships have made a difference in how immigration enforcement has played out in New York City and New York State.
It's such a good question, and I think it's sort of hard. It's hard to know. You know, New York has not seen a big surge of ICE agents. You know, in the way that obviously Minneapolis did, California, Illinois. And yet, it's always still kind of hanging over, you know, everyone's heads. And I think, you know, the governor, the legislature, immigration leaders, everyone is sort of prepared for that to be a possibility, which is why they're passing laws like this. At the same time, you know, I think what the governor would say is that her relationship and her, you know, sort of efforts to deconflict a little bit on the personal level with the president have allowed the state to kind of push that off for the time being.
A lot of people think the governor bailed out Mayor Mamdani, who was also facing a budget deficit. There was a pied-à-terre tax that was approved. Tell us a little bit about the tax, how it might work, and did Mayor Mamdani do well in this budget?
So yes, pied-à-terre tax. This is, you know, it's not a tax on the wealthy exactly, but also it's a tax on the wealthy's holdings, holdings of people who own apartments that are worth over $5 million. Although once you really start to look into the details, it gets a little muddled. New York's property valuation system is very complicated, and I think everyone would sort of say like there's little you know, kind of relationship to reality, which makes actually determining what, you know, what is a second home, not to mention, you know, what's a second home worth over $5 million, very difficult. So the governor's put in this sort of multi-step process that will eventually culminate with like a new valuation system. I mean, I think there's a big asterisk on that, you know, in whether or not it will raise the kind of money that the state is saying that it will. Either way, Mamdani is celebrating it because, you know, he started out saying, you know, we need to tax the rich, and she started off saying no. And I guess he feels like he got a little, you know, bit more than he expected. In terms of a bailout, I mean, I think the state has come to the aid of New York City. It's, you know, largest city, and, you know, with a lot of money and with a lot of help. And I think, you know, that has allowed the mayor to continue to push his agenda without making significant cuts to service, and that's, you know, definitely to his benefit. But I think, you know, what the governor would say is that it's also to her benefit because New York City voters are her voters and her constituents as well. So.
Thanks, Grace, for tracking these complicated issues, and we'll hopefully have you back on to talk about this in the future.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It was my pleasure.
Coming up next, turning bucket list wishes into real-life adventures for older New Yorkers. Joining us now is New York Times reporter Winnie, who covers the people and neighborhoods that make the city what it is, including older transplants moving here for retirement. She recently followed an 80-year-old finally checking off a bucket list tugboat ride through a program called Golden Dreams. We're also joined by Wendy Steinberg, who created Golden Dreams at RiverSpring Living, a senior community in the Bronx that is helping older New Yorkers turn wishes like a tugboat ride or a first ever trip to the opera into reality. Thank you guys both for joining me today.
Thank you, Jeff.
So this article was so fascinating because the program aims to help older people fulfill desires, things they didn't want to do. And one woman you wrote about went on a tugboat. Someone else went indoor skydiving. I'm wondering, what do you think this program says about being an older adult in America right now?
I think it says a lot. This was one of my favorite stories because I think we tend to look at older people and assume that they've done everything, they've seen everything, there are no adventures and no surprises left. And learning about the Golden Dreams program really showed me that we all have to keep living at any age, and especially as we get older. So as I was taking notes for the story, I was taking notes for myself as well, because I'm not getting any younger. And so, you know, it really taught me that you have to keep looking forward. And the stories that we heard from people who had gone on these Golden Dreams, they were so inspiring. I told Wendy that it touched me in so many ways when I spoke to the people about, you know, why they wanted to go, what they got from it, and I spoke to some of the family members, and it just meant so much to everyone. So I love this story.
Wendy, tell us a little bit about how you came up with this program.
This is a new program. It's less than a year old, and we were looking for new ideas about how to help our residents live their best lives. And we found that in talking with our residents, they came from humble beginnings, just working hard, raising families, making ends meet, and they didn't necessarily have a lot of time for themselves. And now that they're in their 80s and 90s, they've got time, and it's never too late for a first. And so we spoke a lot with our residents, learned a lot about them, and found out that many of them had bucket lists that they wanted still to happen.
I'm curious about the process. So when you offer this, it seems like such a big question. Like, what do you want to do that you haven't done? How do the older adults there respond when you come to them with saying, hey, what do you want to do that you haven't done?
We were really surprised because many of them say, I'm good, I lived a great life, I live a great life, I did everything I wanted to do, I'm fine. So we're like, okay, we're gonna have to dig a little deeper. And so the process, actually it takes a while because we talk with residents, we learn about them, what their passions are, their hobbies, and just get that in-depth conversation. So it takes time. And then we find things out, with Carol, our skydiver, she was, we never expected that she would just in an instant say, always wanted to go skydiving, never would have expected that, but that was something always on her mind. Our first golden dream was with a Holocaust survivor who only went to school until she was age 12 because of the war. And because she wasn't educated, she really felt that she was not a full person. And so we made that happen for her and created an entire college experience for her where she took lessons, she saw a scrimmage, and then at the end of the day, the president and provost, this was at University of Mount St. Vincent, put on full regalia. And she walked down the aisle and got an honorary degree. And she said that she always wanted to be someone, and now she feels like she is, because education was so connected to her self-esteem and who she was.
Right, that's fantastic. Winnie, did you see any results or changes amongst the older population? How do they respond to being on a tugboat and going, indoor skydiving?
Well, I think Phyllis loves it. Phyllis,
Yeah.
Phyllis, so she showed up at the tugboat with her own captain's hat, and she wore it all through the trip.
Right.
And then she went back to RiverSpring living, and she wore it throughout the day. She didn't take it off until she went to bed that night. And I think that shows you how much it meant to her. I think we talked to Carol's caregivers. Carol is the psychiatrist, retired psychiatrist who went indoor skydiving, and that was amazing. I saw the video. I'm not good with heights,
Right.
and she was up there floating, and she has trouble walking, so that was something to see. And afterward, she went back to RiverSpring Living and told everybody she was free. And people thought she'd been cured of Parkinson's because she kept saying how free she was. And her caregivers said that afterward she was more social, that she opened up more about her life, and that she was more willing to talk to people. And I thought, that's great. If it's just one experience like that, then that can really change a mindset.
Right.
There are a lot of things that can be done for people, I think, just with this program.
Yeah, it feels like, how do you pay for this? I mean, these things aren't free. How have you guys managed to come up with the resources to help people make their dreams come true?
Well, fortunately, these dreams are so meaningful, but yet they're not necessarily expensive. And many of the partners that we've worked with have donated. So we haven't really had to spend a lot to really make a difference for our residents.
Right, but sometimes you have to say no, right? I think there was one gentleman you wrote about that wanted to go to the Falkland Islands, right?
Yeah, we don't quite have a budget for travel to the Falkland, but you never know. But so that one didn't work out. And then sometimes we just kind of get offbeat requests that aren't really lifelong dreams, like the person who said, hey, I just want a couple of burgers and a soda. And we're like, okay, we'll make that happen for you, but it's not quite a golden dream. And so we definitely got her dream meal served to her.
I'm curious, Winnie, as you write about New York City, I'm wondering, and our population is aging, you know, all the data shows us that. I'm wondering what kind of place is New York City for older people to be? Your facility is located in Riverdale, right?
Yeah.
On beautiful acreage next to
Yes.
the river. But if you're an older adult who wants to live in the city, is that possible for you?
It is possible, and some people would say it's the best place to live. If you go to a retirement home, you are surrounded by people your own age, and some people want that. But other people want to be surrounded by people of all ages. And so I wrote a story about 2 months ago about older transplants that are moving to New York. So they're still a minority. There's still more older people moving out of the city than moving in. But there are thousands of older people who move here in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and some of them have never lived in New York before. And they are moving to places like Williamsburg, they're moving to Brooklyn, they're moving to the Village, and they love it. They have neighbors who are in their 30s and 40s, they're going to birthday parties for 30-year-olds, and you know, they're twice that age, but they feel really young. And they love the excitement, they love all the opportunities in New York, and they're really taking advantage.
Are there other practical benefits to being here as an older adult? I mean, we have probably the best transportation system in the world, right? So that
Yeah.
means you're older adult, you don't have to drive
Exactly.
where you want to go.
That's one of the things that people talked about, that they love coming here because they can give up the car keys. And that gets harder as you get older because, you know, your eyesight is not as good, your reflexes are not as fast. And so it's more relaxing to be able to walk everywhere or to pop onto subway or the bus. New York has a really big aging population. The last time I looked at the numbers, it was 1.4 million people who are 65 and older. And that's larger than the entire population of cities all around the country. I mean, that's a huge number. And in that group, there are people at all different economic levels. So roughly, like, I'd say 20%, just under 20%, are older people who live in poverty. And that's a big issue, especially as the city's facing an affordability crisis. And there needs to be, you know, more thought, more help for folks like that, especially immigrants who come here and who don't have retirement savings. But then at the other end of the spectrum are people who are coming in. Some of them do have money after decades of saving. A lot of them are baby boomers, and they really are adding a lot to the city, both in terms of their enthusiasm, you know, and their finances, because they're coming here, they're supporting businesses, they're buying apartments, and they're adding to the economy in many ways.
What can the city do better to sort of make it a better environment for older adults? You both can weigh in on that question.
There are so many different levels of things that can be done. Years ago, when I was covering the Bronx, I visited Co-op City, which is this really big middle-class housing development in the Bronx, and it was built in the 60s. A lot of the families moved in the 60s and 70s, and so by the 2000s, the families that had stayed there had all aged, and it was called the oldest naturally occurring retirement community in the country. Wow. And I feel like a lot of our neighborhoods are headed in that direction, that they are graying. I look at the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, parts of Brooklyn, and there are families that bought their homes decades ago who, you know, can't afford to leave, don't want to leave, and they're essentially aging in place. And there needs to be consideration of like how they get around, how they pay for things. Even something as simple as how long does it take for them to cross the street? There are some streets that are really wide. Is there a way to make the crossing more narrow? The city has been giving pedestrians a head start at some intersections where they turn the walk signal on 7 seconds before the green light goes on for the drivers. But small things like that make a difference for someone who's trying to run across the street. And then, you know, there's all this, you know, movement on affordable housing. And I think there needs to be more affordable housing specifically for seniors. But Wendy, that's something that RiverSpring's working on.
Yeah, we have several communities off of our Riverdale campus that's supportive housing with services. So we care for formerly homeless seniors, and we provide social services and other programming to get them, back on their feet.
Winnie, you reported that immigrants are a big portion of the city's senior population, and some may feel they don't have a future here. I'm wondering, especially with what's going on in Washington in regards to immigration crackdown enforcement, have you seen an effect on older adults, particularly when it comes to dealing with these issues?
I think for some immigrants, it's been hard. Even harder with the political climate, because now there's a real fear in communities. But even before the political climate, it was tough financially. In 2024, I wrote a story about older immigrants who were still in New York. And we met a man named Francisco from Ecuador who had come here in the 80s. And he, like many other immigrants, wanted to work and to save enough to be able to retire comfortably back home in Ecuador. But he was still here. As of 2 years ago, 70 years old, he would stand on a street corner trying to get someone to hire him for a paint job, to paint houses for the day. And he couldn't afford to retire. And when we looked at the census numbers, we saw that for the first time, 51% of the population of people that are age 65 and older were immigrants. And a lot of that group, they have special issues because some of them have no retirement savings. They don't have access to Social Security. They may not have access to health care. And some of them who came to help with their families may not even be fluent in English. And so there's been a lot of talk about how to help those folks, in particular. But generally, being older in the city brings up different issues and challenges that people don't really think about until you are in that age group.
Have you followed up? What happened to that gentleman?
So after the story ran, we did hear from a philanthropist who ended up making a donation to him. So hopefully, he's doing okay.
Right. Well, your program is a great program, but you're a nonprofit, and,
Right.
and you said you have a pretty modest budget. Tell me a little bit about what you would need to sort of make this a bigger program, or do you think this can be a sort of a larger program, maybe that's adopted by other places?
Well, that's our hope, is that other senior living communities read about it, read Winnie's story, and try to, and replicate it, because I think it's a really simple concept, and it's not really difficult. It's really just about learning about what are those wishes for those in our care. And then we've just been very fortunate that the different partners that we've connected with have been just stepped up and been very willing to make a difference in these people's lives. So I think getting the word out that no matter what your age is, there's always an opportunity to try something new, and that's just a great message that we're really proud of. So our hope is that other communities will replicate it.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for sharing this inspirational story, and hopefully we'll look and see how this program develops over time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's it for our show. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Jeff Mays. If you've enjoyed these conversations and want to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen. Thanks for watching.